Dear beloved community, today's the 31st of October in the year 2021, and it's such a joy to be sitting together with all of you once again. A very happy Halloween or Samhain to those of you in the Northern Hemisphere, and a happy Beltane to those of us in the Southern Hemisphere. Over the past month, we've been focusing on recognizing kindness and offering it back, as well as taking to heart the invitation of the Buddha, our teacher, in the Sutra on the 8 realizations of great beings to practice wholeheartedly and at all times. Tonight we continue our series on nurturing the mind of love with a focus on compassion, and also the first of the 8 realizations of great beings. Occasionally in retreats in Deer Park Monastery, where I was residing for some time, we will offer consultations to retreatants. There was one day that is particularly present for me as I'm sitting and sharing with you, my friends, and that was a day in which I had 2 consultations, one after the other, that have really remained in my mind. I had a consultation first with a practitioner whose sister had just committed suicide, and she'd come to the retreat with that incredible pain, that incredible suffering, that deep loss. And immediately after that consultation, I had a consultation with a practitioner who was in tears that her partner had purchased her a new luxury car, but had purchased a model that she didn't like. And in the moment, honestly, there was a small part of me that was thinking to myself, oh, the first practitioner had real suffering, and the second practitioner maybe had some privilege and really didn't have suffering like the first practitioner. And reflecting on that, I realized that it was a little bit like that famous line in the movie Crocodile Dundee, "That's not a knife, this is a knife." However, the reality of the felt experience of the pain for both of the practitioners was the same. This story came to mind since last week I was in a Zoom conversation with some friends who are involved in working for change. And tonight, we're also going to be reflecting on some aspects of compassion. I'm also sharing this with you because my invitation to each of us today is to be willing to do our work, whatever our work is, and to be aware that when we compare our work to others' work, and we place a value judgment on the work of others or our own work, that this is not necessarily a helpful tendency. I think it's really important to be willing to show up for our work, our edge, wherever it might be. Our work is whenever we're touched by something, no matter what it is, when we're angry, when we're confused, when we're happy, to be willing and courageous enough to look at those things and come to understand their roots. And also to notice when we're not touched by something and to reflect on why that is. I think it's important for us to recognize what our work is, individually and collectively, and then to be willing to do our work and to resist the temptation to only focus on or wait for other people or groups of people to do what we think their work is. Their work, the transformation of their hearts, may be a bit different to our own. It probably is. And also, it might never happen in the way we expect, or quite the way we expect. And we'll grow tired if we're constantly only other focused or focused on the outside. Our foundational work for real and lasting change, the work that I feel that we're called to in this time, is to notice when we feel angry, judged, tired, burned out, discriminated against, and so on, and become interested in the roots of those individually and collectively. It's then that insight arises, not when we get rid of these things only. Insight doesn't arise in the absence of these things, but right from within them if we shed the light of mindful awareness on them. And to be willing to embark and remain on that journey of discovery no matter what inconvenient truths we discover about ourselves, about life, and about others. And for sure, if we're lucky, we'll discover many. In some way, while you need to be present for my work and hold space for that, and I need to be present for and hold space for your work, and there's an intimate connection between these. My work is my work, my edge is my edge, and your edge, your transformation, is yours. I think it's time for each of us to fully take responsibility for the unique journey of discovery that each of us is on. And when we show up in a full way for our own transformation and begin seeing and understanding the roots of our own pain and suffering, we begin to have space enough in our heart to begin to really see the many complex causes and conditions that have given rise to the pain of another person or group of people or situation. There are times that we can have so much pain that our attention is constantly drawn outside to the very real discrimination, anger, dismissiveness, and judgment occurring, and we end up focusing only on what they, whoever they are to us, need to fix or need to do to fix the situation. And for sure, they may need to fix a lot. But what if they don't quite yet have the awareness, willingness, or capacity? What does that mean for us? Lately, it seems to me that rather than being a platitude, something nice that we say because it sounds spiritual, the practice of showing up for life, our life, just as it is, means embracing the reality that not every possible transformation within ourselves or in the world may completely happen in this lifetime. And in a strange and counterintuitive way, to take inspiration and encouragement to engage from that. To be willing to, in a real sense and in a metaphorical sense, plant a tree, even though we're not going to be around for the fullness of growth of that tree necessarily. Here in Mountain Spring, Brother Tenzin, myself, and the sisters, and so many practitioners have been planting trees. We have been planting ginkgo trees. The ginkgo trees that we've planted are just about up to the middle of my shin. And I look at these ginkgo trees and I know that I'm not going to be here I'm not going to be walking on this earth in the same form for the fullness of that growth of the ginkgo tree. And yet we plant the tree. We plant the tree physically, but we plant the tree metaphorically as well. We're all works in progress. And from this understanding, we also know that there's always more progress to be made. In some way, the fact that there'll always be more to discover, always more work to be done to transform our mind and our heart, to protect the earth and to work for a more inclusive society is an inspiration. It's a calling forth into action. The real action of first noticing all the complex nuances of our own minds and hearts, and then noticing and creating space for those of whoever we call the other or they, and from that basis of not pushing anything or anyone aside, moving forward together to create lasting change. This is not easy. Each of us has a wound, and our wound can call us forth if we know how to take care of it well. It is, however, possible to react from the place of this untransformed wound. And in this case, there's a tendency to simply repeat the same patterns over and over again. This is also true in the case of activism. If we just react from our pain, then there's a chance of just recreating the same dynamics over and over again. In a sense, it's like a reactivism. Speaking of the healing that we're each called to bring to the world, I've noticed that if we don't look deeply into our wounds and understand that when we shine the light of mindfulness on our wounds, on our pain, and understand their roots, that it's a source of understanding and insight rather than a weakness, then the shadow side is that our engagement can somehow come from and feed into a sense of disconnection or disempowerment or lack. And we end up in some way actually creating more of what we're hoping to transform in ourselves or in the world around. And this can become a source of depletion. This is engagement or reactivism from the untransformed wound. On the other hand, if we as practitioners, as good students of our teacher Te, acknowledge, embrace, and look deeply into the causes and conditions of our pain and suffering, what I'm calling our wound, then it becomes possible to work for change from a non-resistant place, since we also understand that everything has its causes and conditions for arising. This is because that is. With this understanding, we know that, as the saying goes, whatever we resist persists. And rather than just resisting, which is struggle in some way on a more superficial level, we see how things have come to be, all the causes and conditions, and we engage with the pain and its roots. And we see that everybody is wounded in some way. Seeing this, compassion is born. Compassion doesn't mean and has never meant non-action. Fierce compassion means to be willing to hold the paradox of seeing beyond the surface level in a situation or in ourselves. As I shared just a few moments ago, if we're able to understand our suffering as a source of insight, if it's handled well, then it's possible to engage in outer change or activism from a place of understanding how something has come to be, of seeing its root causes. If we can do that, then our engagement comes from a place of manifesting the kind of change and energy that we want to see, rather than just a simplistic fight or reactivity only against what we don't want to see or what we don't want to experience. That has a tendency to just create more of what we don't want to see. And that's also true in terms of our spiritual path. In the Jewish tradition, in the Talmud, there's a saying, to paraphrase the Talmud, there's a saying that our practice is to save the world entire. Notice the nuance in English. The placement of the words means to save or embrace the world just as it is, completely. The mess, the pain, the discrimination, the confusion. This is, of course, the world outside, but most importantly, the world of our human heart. Speaking of the Jewish tradition, there's a beautiful wisdom tale that's retold by Isaac Bashevis Singer in his Tales of the Hasidim. A student comes to a rabbi and says, "When does the dawn break?" And as many of us can confirm, it can feel as if we've been walking in the dark night for a long time now, and we're just waiting for the dawn to break. The rabbi's answer is very beautiful and deep. The rabbi replies, "It's dawn. The dawn breaks when you can see the face of another person and clearly recognize that this is the face of your beloved sibling. This means to embrace the other person in their entirety, just as they are, and even as they try to exclude us, to not give in to the temptation to exclude them from our heart. That would be too easy. And this, to me, is what happens with the phenomenon of cancel culture, which to me is a byproduct of the interaction between our own cognitive biases and the relentless social media algorithm that shows us more of what the algorithm thinks we agree with or like, and less of what challenges us. And to me, I observe that we've begun to behave like this in our life and towards others, and actually also in a way towards ourselves. We try to cancel out parts of ourselves that we don't like or that we don't want, rather than doing what the Buddha and our teacher Te has invited, and that is to embrace all parts of ourselves and to look into all parts of ourselves. The effects of this are deep. It also seems important at this moment when we reflect on compassion, when we're reflecting on compassion and embracing the world entire, which is a lifetime's work, to acknowledge that not every single person on this planet or group of people is going to roll out the red carpet for us as a group or individuals. I don't know if there's anybody who's experienced always having the red carpet rolled out for them. I'm learning myself to be okay with this and to keep going regardless. If it helps one person, it's worthwhile to not give up, even though we might think of giving up 10 or 20 or 30 times a day. I certainly have many moments like that. To not be discouraged. And in some strange way, as I shared earlier, to take comfort in the fact that there's always more to discover, always more to accomplish, always further to go, and to recognize that it all begins and it ends in our own heart. And that our transformation is intimately connected with the transformation of what we call the world outside. As the wonderful Anne Lamott shared, and I'm paraphrasing here mainly because I'm too lazy to go and look up the exact quote, I finally realized that the most radical and most subversive thing that I could do was to show up for my life just as it is and to not be ashamed. That is one of the fundamental starting points of the Buddhist path, of the spiritual path, to show up for our life just as it is, to embrace all parts of ourselves, all of our pain, all of our suffering, all of our joys, to shine the light of mindful awareness on all these things, and insight and understanding blossoms from there. Let's have a sound of the bell. In terms of this practice of cultivating great compassion, another aspect is being willing to look at this sense of I am, whatever label might emerge for us in each moment, and to understand that while there's truth in that label, in some ways it's like a snapshot that we take when we're on holiday. It captures a moment, but not the whole lived experience of that week or 2 weeks away. A label, while important, this sense of I am in a moment, captures a snapshot of us, a certain perspective, and at the same time, we're an ever-changing reality with always more to discover. We tend in each moment, just as in the moment I described in the consultation, we tend to have a fixed sense of who we are and fix the other person in a certain position as well. I made in that consultation, I made an evaluation of that person. I fixed that person in a certain way in my mind. And I wasn't in contact with all of the different causes and conditions that had given rise both to that person's experience and also where I was coming from in that moment. The next practice of cultivating bodhicitta is called great love and great compassion. When we've practiced the other aspects, recognizing everyone as being our mother in terms of what they give birth to in us, begun to recognize the kindness of others, the support that we receive from others, and from that place felt like we wanted to offer that same care and concern back, then our heart naturally opens. This is not calculated, but a natural feeling of closeness and warmth. You can also call it maybe a sense of cherishing. We cherish ourselves, we cherish others, and we're concerned about their welfare. In the Buddhist understanding, great compassion emerges when we recognize the pain in our own heart, the pain in others, and the world around. And we recognize that even as we wish to be happy and for others to be happy in this life, that there is a lot of pain. And we begin to see the causes and conditions that have given rise to a situation, a particular behavior, or a mental formation, rather than only focusing on the surface. And we begin by observing our own experience and how suffering feels for us. And from that understanding, we don't want others to suffer. And we actually see that everybody is suffering quite deeply, and in many cases operating primarily from the base of pain. And so in this way, in compassion, there's this sense of tender vulnerability, which also means not to hold back any part of ourselves in each moment, but to meet each moment fully without pretending, without hiding behind any particular label or position. Or if we see that we are, to smile to it and to let it go. And this is a lifelong process, since we're well trained to believe that we're not powerful and we're conditioned to be distracted. Many of us somehow think of vulnerability as a weakness, but the word vulnerability simply means to be open. By being open, we can more clearly see ourselves and the world around us. This broad view gives us the ability and the power to grow, to heal, and to be fully engaged in our lives. We often think that if we're open and vulnerable, it's not a very secure place. And that's something, unfortunately, that many of us learn quite early on, and we close down portions of our heart progressively, losing a sense of spontaneity and self-expression out of fear. And so one of the first steps in opening this soft spot in our heart is becoming aware of the layers of fears and self-beliefs that close our heart. I call these our masks. And sometimes these are masks that we use to cover our true face, but sometimes they're masks that we use to cover our pain. And Buddhist practice is a practice of recognizing, smiling to, and releasing these masks. The Buddha once said that if someone offers us a gift, it's up to us to take it, to receive it or not, to take it on board or not. So we don't necessarily need to receive every single gift that comes our way. This capacity comes about when we're willing to recognize and confront all of the places that we hide and to be authentic to our lived experience. So what in each moment are we hiding behind? Are we hiding behind a position, a view, the idea that information is wisdom? Are we hiding behind our pain? Or are we hiding behind perhaps a kind of a disembodied sense of spirituality, the idea of rising above or transcending rather than deep embodiment? This is for me, has been a very helpful reflection. There's a poem by a poet called Chelin Harkin. It's called The Worst Thing. And it speaks to this. I'll just read an excerpt here. The worst thing we ever did was to put God in the sky, out of reach, pulling the divinity from the leaf, sifting out the holy from our bones, insisting that God isn't bursting dazzlement through everything we've made a hard commitment to see as ordinary, stripping the sacred from everywhere to put a cloud man elsewhere, prying closeness from your heart. The worst thing we ever did is pretend God isn't the easiest thing in the universe, available to every soul in every breath. If we want to heal the world, and many of us do, many of us are walking on what we call the Bodhisattva path, the path of transforming our minds and hearts at the same time as wanting to heal the world. If we want to heal the world and we want to heal our lives, it's time to get real. And the person we most need to be real with, or we first need to be real with, is ourselves. There's a beautiful painting that I love so much, although I can't actually remember the name of the artist. But it's the painting of an old man sitting solidly on a chair. He's an absolutely ordinary man, dressed in a suit, his face is at rest. There's nothing particularly wrong. Nothing's really out of place in general with this man, except that his heart is exposed. He's fully clothed, he's in a suit, but his heart is exposed. And from outside of the frame of the painting, a hand reaches in and touches his heart. In that initial moment, the hand's not trying to heal the heart or to change it or to fix it or to put it back inside the old man's body, but just touching it. It's through revealing our heart, first to ourselves, and then being real in our encounters, choosing over and over again to be authentic with each moment, whatever that might mean, that we become human and we allow others to be human also. To me, this is what the essence of meditation practice, of what mindfulness practice is, to be authentic and real in every moment. What does it mean to you to breathe authentically, to breathe an in-breath authentically, to walk authentically, to not cover over your experience of the moment in any way? Once we put ourselves in a position in which we're vulnerable in the sense of being authentic, not hiding, then we discover that actually vulnerability is a real strength. And it's from that vulnerability that real connection is, or true connection is possible. We learn that like a tree, even if our branches might shake in the wind, we remain rooted. Bringing this sense of intimacy and vulnerability to our practice can be confronting, since as our beloved Teyak Tan used to say, nothing is covered over with bells and incense. We're showing up fully for everything that's arising just as it is, with no hiding. That's the unromantic but essential foundation of a transformative practice to me. And in sharing this, I'm not sharing from a white marble podium, but I'm sharing from my own experience of deep suffering. A few of the lighter and more gentler forms of suffering that I've experienced in my life I included in the book because they're relevant to the 8 realizations. And I wanted to invite each of my friends, when they read those stories, to tap into their own lives. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell, and then we'll begin to explore the first realization in the discourse of the 8 realizations of great beings. Last week in our book club, I shared that the Sutra of the 8 Realizations of Great Beings is a sutra, a teaching in which there are no things that are not necessary. It's just the absolutely essential aspects of the Buddhist path. It is the real heart of the Buddha's teaching, from the most simple understanding to the very highest understanding. It's the Buddha's heart teaching to each one of us. It's almost like all of the extraneous layers have been stripped back to their absolute essence. And so this week and this month, we're going to be looking into the first realization. So I'll read Tay's translation. The first realization is the awareness that the world is impermanent. Political regimes are subject to fall. Things composed of the 4 elements are empty, containing within them the seeds of suffering. Human beings are composed of 5 aggregates and are without a separate self. They are always in the process of change, constantly being born and constantly dying. They are empty of self and without a separate existence. The mind is the source of all confusion, and the body the forest of all unwholesome actions. Meditating on this, we can be released from the realm of birth and death. In last month's talk on the introduction to this sutra, I mentioned that the core text of the Sutra of the 8 Realizations of Great Beings is divided into 2 major areas. The first realization, which presents the core insights of the Buddha, and then the remaining 7 realizations, which offer us concrete practices to generate these same insights within our own lives. The first realization, which I just read, is a direct transmission from the Buddha to you, to each one of us. The Buddha says, this, insert your own name, is the essence of what I've discovered about the nature of reality. This is really how things are. If you'd like to have a similar insight into the nature of reality, please look into and put into practice these things. Whenever we encounter a teaching, whether it's a sutra like the Discourse on the 8 Realizations of Great Beings, or a teaching in our daily lives, it's really important to stop and ask ourselves, how do I apply this? How do I walk? How do I eat? How do I wash my hair, if I have any, with this insight? How do I bring this right into the heart of my life? Otherwise, it's just a great idea or words written on a paper, a philosophy. It's not a lived reality. It's a notion, a view, a position, an opinion. And goodness knows we have more than enough of those in the world of our mind and in the world of our heart. Our teacher, Tay, in founding Plum Village, he always reminded us that 1 hour of study needs to go together with 7 hours of putting it into practice. In fact, he said at least 7 hours of putting something into practice. This helps us to be able to do what the Buddha most hoped, to embody the insight, the teaching, and not to just recite it like a parrot. By the way, I love parrots. Here in Mountain Spring in the morning and in the evening, I'm visited by king parrots. I feed them birdseed, and if I haven't put the seed out, they come and knock on the door with their beaks. So to not take things on as articles of faith, but rather to touch them through our own experience, to know things for ourselves. It feels important to mention one thing, and that is an underlying assumption in the text. And it's also an underlying assumption in Buddhism in general. The Buddha says, I have done this. So can you. You have the capacity. I've had the chance to attend a few academic conferences, which I tend to enjoy. And one conference on mindfulness and the brain that I was present at a few years ago, all of the other presenters were sitting backstage and everyone was talking over everybody else and sharing about which academic papers they published on which topics and so on. It was actually a really interesting conversation, and everyone was sharing what they were going to be presenting during the conference. And listening to all of these amazing presenters, I thought to myself, what on earth do I have to offer? And I realized that my most important qualifications were whatever peace and joy, whatever little peace and joy I might be able to offer. And when one of the other presenters, one of the academics, asked me what I planned to be presenting, I shared with her that I would just be inviting the bell. And what I meant by that was that I think it didn't matter so much what I would be talking about. In many ways, what I would be talking about is in fact the least important. But maybe even in some ways, it's a distraction, the metaphorical, shiny, pretty things. But rather, how would I be walking? How would I be eating? How would I be interacting? How would I demonstrate peace, joy, and mindfulness in an academic conference about mindfulness, brain, and interpersonal neurobiology? So the Buddha always reminds us to practice in such a way that we know these things for ourselves. So it's important to ask ourselves as we embark on this journey, particularly the journey of looking into the first realization, how we can root these insights right within the heart of our own life, allowing them to manifest in their own way within our experience. The first realization offers us the 4 key insights of the Buddha: impermanence, emptiness, non-self, and impurity. The 4 insights are not philosophical concepts, they're doorways of realization to walk through not only once, but in each and every moment of our lives. Please, this month, as you're looking into the first realization, please don't go off and read every single thing about these topics, or listen to every Dharma talk in the hopes of intellectually grasping them. Do what is most unattractive and somehow, conversely, most powerful. Turn towards your life. Look at your experience and see if you notice these things arising in your life. I've said this before, and maybe I'll say it again. When receiving a teaching, it's important to remember that we don't want to manufacture any experience. Even as long-term practitioners, it's really easy to get caught in concepts and notions discovered or shared by others. Samsara, liberation, enlightenment, non-self, and so on. rather than discovering for ourselves what our moment by moment experience of samsara is, what our experiences of liberation, non-self, and enlightenment are. Please don't be a parrot, or if you are a parrot, come and visit me and I'll happily feed you. For sure, we need to ascribe to some shared concepts in order to get through the day. However, it's important to realize that these are simply ways to describe aspects of reality, and the words are not the reality itself. One of the characteristics of penetrating insight is that it transcends our usual conceptual framework, and at the same time is often quite simple. And this can seem almost counterintuitive or even disappointing. Moments like this, in which we experience an aspect of our lives or our beings in a new way, are aha moments. For a long time, honestly, I equated insight with complexity, when in fact, the exact opposite is most often the case. It's disappointing and a bit devastating, isn't it? It's so much easier to hide behind notions, behind views, or someone else's complicated theories. The real challenge, the real work is what we really don't want to do, to not hide anymore from the way things are for us, to turn towards our lives, to love them for their ordinariness, and in this way begin to understand our own habitual patterns and the roots of our own individual and collective pain. Earlier, I mentioned the saying, whatever you resist persists. There's a very popular t-shirt and activist slogan, resist. I would say that in terms of meditation practice, if we do need to resist, and we can't resist resisting, then the thing we most need to resist is remaining up in our head all the time. In each and every moment, when we notice that we're up in our heads, to practice sinking down into the body, into the experience as it is. And we look into the soft and tender and almost silent place in our heart, and we discover what's there. This is not flashy at all, and it's not exciting in the usual sense, but it's real. It's the real heart of the practice. And we often mistake the shiny, pretty things for the real and embodied, unadorned heart of the practice. So engaging deeply with our absolutely ordinary lives is a fundamental and important aspect of spiritual practice. It's often said that we go through, in our spiritual practice in the Zen world, it's often said that we go through the stage of seeing that mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. They're kind of separate. And then we go through the stage of seeing that mountains were never mountains and rivers were never rivers. And then we return to the ordinary world and we see that mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. And so many of us get stuck in either the first or the second places and forget, as Tay has told us, that the path of return continues the journey. Or as it says later on in this sutra, the 8 realizations of great beings, the Bodhisattva, the practitioner, then returns to the ordinary world. So what is your ordinary world? This ordinary world includes our collective and social and political lives as well. The first realization begins with the awareness that the world is impermanent and political regimes are subject to fall. And this invites us to consider the relationship between what we consider to be the world outside and the world inside. Actually, it might be good to take a look at the last sentence in the first realization. This sentence is the fruit that will be realized by meditating upon and embodying the 4 key insights that the Buddha offered in this realization. The Buddha tells us basically what to expect if we put into practice these realizations. The Buddha says, meditating on this, you can be released from the realm of birth and death. And it's said that the highest fruit of Buddhist practice is liberation from what's called the endless round of birth and death, or to use the Sanskrit term, samsara. This is the endless round of the same ultimately unsatisfactory things over and over again, both within our own mind as well as in the world around us. Please remember here that birth and death in their original senses don't only refer to physical birth and death, but also to the momentary arising and passing away of everything, thoughts, breaths, sensations, and so on. Each of us has got our own unique patterns of suffering and joy, as well as collective patterns that we keep repeating endlessly until we recognize them and we become disenchanted with them, and we discover that there's a way to transform our situation, as scary as that change might be. There are many technical terms used to describe these repeating patterns, such as klesha, afflictions, and so on. I find it helpful and practical to consider my own repeating patterns of behavior or thoughts in terms of entrenchments. And this, as we discovered a few months ago, is a term that's used in one of the most ancient recorded Buddhist texts, the Book of Eights, the Atthagavagga. And these entrenchments, as we shared before, might be just little ruts in the ground, or they might be deep trenches like the ones dug in Europe during the First World War. Change can be scary because even though many of these entrenchments cause us or those around us pain, we tend to identify ourselves with them. And in some cases, we might even somehow mistake them for liberation. So this month, as part of our practice, it can be helpful to have a look in our own lives and see if we notice any entrenchments or habit energies, and consider whether they're related to our deepest aspiration, whether they lead to that sense of freedom that many of us describe looking for, wanting to touch, wanting to cultivate in our lives. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell. The second, in the first realization, the first of the four key insights is impermanent. Impermanence, or anicca, is a central and key insight in Buddhism. And in the context of the first realization, it means that every single thing within us and around us is constantly in a state of change. In fact, in Buddhism, impermanence is considered to be a fundamental characteristic of everything that is. There are those of us who, deeply touching this teaching, really find it very confronting. The ground can fall out from under our feet. It's not an easy thing to let go of all of the ways that we've defined reality up to now, or to realize that in many ways what we've called reality is merely a construct, at most a faint reflection of things as they really are. The aim of the Buddha was to provide us with concrete tools that would help us question our way of seeing things, and to be able to experience reality as it truly is, to see that every single thing by its very nature is constantly in a state of change, can be very confronting. Since we want to hold on, thinking that holding on or actually grasping tightly will give us the security that we crave. And many of you will recall that powerful image in the Atthagavagga of being like a monkey that is grasping on one branch, swinging to another, and already reaching out to grasp onto the next branch. However, the Buddha didn't teach us impermanence to add to our pain and suffering, to discourage us or to water seeds of depression. Rather than being pessimistic, if we allow the insight of impermanence to root itself deeply within our consciousness, it can be an invitation to live our life beautifully and meaningfully, to touch the preciousness of this moment, which is not going to occur again. Every single thing is always in a process of coming to be, of manifesting for a while, and that while might be a split second. It might be a minute. It could be a year, a decade, 100 years, 1,000 years. But it'll manifest for a while, depending on causes and conditions, and then it'll pass away. Nothing remains the same for very long. When I was practicing in Sri Lanka, I spent some time in the hill country, and I stayed in a hermitage in the middle of the tea plantations. I had a very simple room that had a small low bed. Monastics tend to sleep very low to the floor or on the floor. So there, because of the rain and the wet weather, there was a small platform that was just slightly off the floor with 4 legs, and a sitting meditation place. And there was an enclosed walking meditation path, which was about 15 steps or 20 steps long. At the end of the path was a skeleton, and it was a reminder of the fact that we are going to die, not only at some point in the future, but that we're dying and being born right here and right now. That birth and death doesn't occur only at some fixed or imagined point in what we call the past or the future, but both of these things are happening in each and every moment in our body and in our mind and in what we call the world around us. Zen is filled with poetry and music, and in Plum Village we practice little poems whenever we're doing something, opening the door, going to the bathroom, sitting down, and there's the gatha for waking up in the morning. Waking up this morning, I smile. 24 brand new hours are before me. I vow to live fully in each moment and to look on all beings with eyes of compassion. Now, actually we're not even guaranteed 24 hours. We're not guaranteed to have this full day. If we really understand impermanence, we see how things are changing from moment to moment, we're not even guaranteed this moment. One of these days, this moment will be our last moment. So if we understand this, if we touch it deeply, what's the most important thing for us to do, for you to do right now? For those of us who are getting older, and I'm among them, impermanence is often quite easy to contemplate. The reality of impermanence means that whatever we're experiencing, it is of the nature to change. It's not going to remain like that forever. If we touch this reality deeply, it's actually not that discouraging. It's quite encouraging. When we're experiencing a difficult moment, the insight of impermanence helps us to realize that it will not and cannot remain like this forever. The insight of impermanence helps us to recognize and treasure these moments of happiness, joy, and delight that we experience. And so the first invitation in this first realization is for each of us to begin to embody the Buddha's insight in our own lives by contemplating our own moment by moment lived experience of impermanence within us and within the world. Touching the insight of impermanence is empowering. What can I do in this moment so that this breath, this step, this interaction can be the most meaningful that I've ever had? What do I want to give birth to in my life, in my mind? What do I most want to set my heart upon? This present moment is our opportunity to be alive. So for some of us, impermanence might seem a little bit theoretical. And I've already offered the invitation to look deeply into our lives. And we can start with something very simple and yet very profound. We can simply bring our attention to our breath. If we find it difficult and we experience impermanence as something too conceptual, then just notice a breath. Become aware of how the breath, the in-breath is coming in, the experience is changing moment to moment to moment, and then there's a moment in which in-breath comes to a conclusion, and then the out-breath begins. And then there's a moment when that experience of out-breath comes to a conclusion and gives rise to an in-breath. If we observe that, and we go deeply into that experience of breath, mindfulness of breathing, then we will have on an experiential level an understanding of impermanence, and we begin to notice how every single thing within us, as we've shared, is in this process of coming to be, of remaining for a moment and then transforming. The second area of contemplation is shunyata, or emptiness. The inside of emptiness goes hand in hand with impermanence. Emptiness can sound quite heavy. This heaviness was reflected in some of the early English translations of shunyata, which were translations like the void. These translations come almost out of a dualistic mindset in which there's an idea of something and then there's an idea of nothing in opposition to each other. And that's not the insight of emptiness. Basically, emptiness as an insight means that nothing can exist by itself alone. Everything is interdependent and interpenetrating and is constantly arising and passing away due to various causes and conditions. And also, within the insight of emptiness, there's the understanding that the idea of existence and non-existence is also a dualistic view. Our teacher Tay always reminds us when we hear the word emptiness, it's essential to ask ourselves, empty of what? Empty of what exactly? If we walk through this gateway of emptiness, sooner or later we understand that this is because that is. This is not because that is not. And we'll understand that one way to approach emptiness as a characteristic of everything is to realize that everything that is constantly in relationship with each other. In the Plum Village tradition, rather than using the word emptiness, we like to use the word interbeing, which encapsulates this essential insight of interpenetration or interrelationship. One way to begin to develop an awareness of interbeing, and actually the next insight in this realization, is called the emptiness of the four elements. This is to contemplate the interrelationships that come together to co-create a particular thing. As Tay reminds us, we can see the sunshine, the rain, the earth, the intention in a carrot. Eventually understanding that there's not one single thing in the cosmos that the carrot doesn't contain. When we begin to practice the invitation to see a cloud in the tea, to see the sun in a carrot, and so forth, it might still be, for some of us, a little theoretical. So the Buddha offers us a concrete practice to contemplate the interbeing nature of the four elements within and around us. In the first realization, the Buddha says, basically, okay, everything's empty. Everything is, especially the five skandhas and the four elements, which are the foundation of everything that is. And this line is key. Everything is empty. Everything is, especially all of the ways you tend to identify. The skandhas, the 5 skandhas, which we'll share about in a moment, are basically all the different ways that we tend to identify and try to fix ourselves and others in time and in space. Form, feelings, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. And then the 4 elements are earth, air, fire, and water. If we look deeply into them, once again we're reminded that nothing can exist by itself. Fire can't exist in the absence of oxygen. All of the elements are deeply in relationship with each other. One of the central teachings of Buddhism that flows from the inside of emptiness or interbeing is that there's no permanent self, no fixed identity, or what I like to call the Holy Trinity of I, me, and mine. While there is this insight and understanding, there's also the awareness of our mind's tendency to create a self in every moment. When there's a stimulus, a sound, a smell, a thought, or so on, we tend to fix ourselves into a certain position. For example, I like this, I don't like that, this is true, that's false, superior, inferior, equal, and so on. If we recognize impermanence outside as well as the impermanence of our thought process, and if any of you have ever sat in meditation, I think we have all experienced the impermanence of our thought process, which is another wonderful testament to the reality of impermanence. Then we begin to understand on increasingly subtle levels this truth of impermanence. And we come to the realization that who we are is constantly in a process of change. And as we continue to observe our life and our responses on increasingly subtle levels, we begin to realize that the group of processes that we call ourself only exists in relationship to an imagined other. Within this first realization, we're invited to concretely contemplate non-self within the framework of the 5 skandhas that we mentioned before. The Buddha gets right to the point in this realization, and as I shared before, the experience of practicing with the 8 realizations of great beings is a practice of peeling back layers to reveal the essence. The Buddha doesn't invite us to contemplate non-self as a philosophical concept, as many of us would no doubt like to do, but he rather asked us to do the most scary but liberating thing. He asked us to direct our attention to the many layers we use to identify ourselves and to consider whether these layers are based on anything. When we can use the conventional term I or myself, what we're usually referring to are these 5 skandhas: our form, our feelings, our perceptions, our mental formations, and consciousness, which interpenetrate and are also constantly in a process of change. And as I've practiced with this, I myself have noticed that I tend to identify more or less with certain skandhas at different points during the day, depending on the situation or the kind of interaction that I'm having. For example, at some moments we might identify more with form, the body. At other moments, feelings might come to the forefront. I'm just this anger, or I'm just this happiness, or so on. Or our perceptions, or mental formations, or volition, or with consciousness, mind. As an exercise, you might find it helpful if you notice yourself responding from the base of one of these skandhas, to smile to it, to zoom out, and then notice how you're experiencing the moment through other skandhas. For example, if you notice you're feeling frustrated or angry or happy, how do you feel in your body? How are you experiencing that in your body? How about in your perceptions, and so on? In this way, the 5 skandhas become a meditation object. We notice how they're constantly changing. They're constantly changing form. And also the usual ways that we identify ourselves begin to shift. Is physical form always the same, or is it changing moment to moment? How about perception and the objects of our perception? Are they set in time? How about feelings? Do we always have the same feeling from moment to moment, or does it change? So by looking into our experience, we begin to understand that absolutely everything is in a constant state of change, development, and passing away in each and every moment. The fourth and final insight, key insight in this first realization is traditionally translated as impurity, which has in English a kind of a heavy connotation to some of us due to our linguistic background. However, impurity can also mean not leading anywhere. And I find this approach practical and helpful because it reminds me of an essential quality of the path, disenchantment. Recently, I was offering a class on the introduction to monastic life on Zoom to a young person interested in exploring becoming a monastic. And that young person asked me, it's a lot of sacrifice to give up so many things. I agreed that it can definitely be a sacrifice if we're just throwing away things because we think we have to. Just getting rid of things because we think we have to. That's a lot of sacrifice. However, if we've looked deeply and we recognize that certain things are no longer needed in our lives, whether those things are cars or jobs or whatever it might be, houses and or money or whatever it might be, or whether it might be mind states or positions, then moving on becomes the easiest thing in our world. It becomes a joy and not a lot of suffering, not a big sacrifice. Impurity can also mean not in and of itself. And certainly we've all understood that everything interpenetrates, but in this sense, not in and of itself can remind us of our tendency to be pulled this way and that, to be divided. We have a tendency to feel that we're not whole or we're not complete just as we are. And one of the main and key tendencies of our mind is to continually run after something that we think is going to give us what we think we're lacking, whether it's happiness, peace, liberation, or so on. And one of the innate tendencies of our mind is always to be searching for something, whether on the coarse level of physical reality or on the more subtle emotional and psychological levels. The things that we tend to run after to give us that little moment of comfort or ease can't do that for very long, since they're changing all the time, and so are we. The contemplation on impurity is an invitation in this way for us to bring our attention to and recognize what we've talked about before as volition, the things that we're being pulled towards or that we're being repelled from in each and every moment. By engaging with a concrete practice such as the contemplation on the four nutriments of life, edible foods, sense impressions, volition, and consciousness, we begin to recognize something radical, that we actually have all the conditions we think we need, all the things that we're so desperately searching for. And we begin to recognize and understand the individual landscape of our searching. Let's take a moment to enjoy our breath and to enjoy a sound of the bell. the purpose, or one of the key purposes of Buddhist practice, is to cultivate and generate understanding, insight, and compassion. And the beginning point for developing wisdom is admitting to ourselves that we don't know things completely, even if we think we do. And to do this, we need to be willing to ask ourselves, are we sure? If we're really lucky and we apply the practices of mindfulness as our teachers have guided us to do, we begin to see and already touch the things that we used to think that we might only be able to touch or attain after 20 years of hard labor. We can touch them in some sense right here and right now. This is the invitation that we received from the founder of our lineage, Master Rinzai, Master Rinzai in Japanese, when he said, please stop all of your running around. Turn your attention around and become the true person that you've always been. Become a real human being. This is the essence of the practice that's being offered in this fourth area of contemplation. The contemplation on impurity, to recognize where we're being diluted and to not allow ourself or our attention to be diluted any longer. A great master, a great teacher once said, don't waste your time trying to understand the Buddha. Turn around and understand your own mind. And as I've shared before, talks and books are not the Dharma. They're about the Dharma. In some way, they're the shiny, pretty things that are attractive and useful, but the real invitation, as unglamorous as it might sound for each of us, is to look at what's arising in our own lives. I can tell you right now that it's possible to read every single sutra and commentary, and even to get a master's degree in Buddhist philosophy, and possibly suffer as much or even more than before if we don't put any of the things that we've learned into practice. A lot of knowledge, a lot of information will come that way, but insight and wisdom come about through turning towards our lived experience. By putting even the most simple one thing into practice, for example, stopping with the sound of the bell, we create the conditions for transformation on all levels. This insight doesn't come from books. It's been within you all along, just waiting for the right conditions to manifest. There are some strong phrases in the first realization, such as the mind is the source of all confusion, and the body the forest of all unwholesome actions. So in order to unpack this, it might be helpful to take a little look at what's meant by unwholesome. We'll be exploring this in some depth in later talks, but for now it might be helpful to understand that wholesome means in line with your deepest aspiration, leading to individual and collective freedom and joy. And unwholesome means the thoughts, words, and actions that contribute to individual and collective pain and suffering. And as we shared before, the last sentence in the first realization, meditating on this, you can be released from the realm of birth and death, shows us the understanding that will manifest by looking deeply into, and more importantly, embodying the four key insights offered in this first realization. It'll be good to take a moment, or maybe even a lifetime, to contemplate that. Do we actually want to be liberated from these patterns? Don't answer too quickly, because it means being willing over and over again to have the rug pulled out from underneath you. Just when you think that all of your security has disappeared, then to wake up and to discover that something else is possible, that there's a way out, a way to transform our situation and that of the world entire. If you find that the deepest answer in your heart is yes, then please keep walking no matter what. Good luck. I'm looking forward to practicing together with everyone over the next month as we delve more deeply into these insights in depth. we'll come to a close with 3 sounds of the bell.